Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Our first speaker this afternoon is Bill Howe from the University of Washington. It's a big project here, I think. Here.
Hi, my name is Bill Howe. I'm from the University of Washington, as we said, and I'll be talking about a new partnership for cross-scale, cross-domain eScience. This is a collaboration with Carnegie Mellon and the Moore Foundation. And so mostly I'm going to be talking about the work we've been doing at the University of Washington at this place called the eScience Institute. So we were formed in January of 2008, and we have a logo. There it is. It was free. We have a URL. You can write this down or just remember it. And we have some evidence that people are actually linking to our URL because as of last night, we became the first link on Google when you type in eScience Institute. And I was hoping Carol and Dave would be in the room because unfortunately they got bumped to number 2 when they were the first eScience Institute in the UK and actually coined the term eScience.
No, you have that dash there.
Well, so you're exactly right. So it turns out if you do put a hyphen between the E and the S, the positions are reversed. So
Yeah.
maybe it's fair. I prefer this spelling for obvious reasons. So we also put this into Bing, but apparently eScience is a misspelling, is interpreted as a misspelled word, and so nothing comes up. But that's unfortunate. Okay, so the eScience Institute at University of Washington. I won't try to justify the rationale, because I think everybody, if you've attended this conference, you sort of understand the importance of eScience and why we do this. I will point out that our strategy here was to sort of bootstrap a cadre of research scientists, of which I am one, in computer science, and then add faculty in key areas, and then build out kind of a consultancy of students and programmers to handle technology transfer. So currently we're funded through $1 million a year from direct appropriation from the state, and we were awarded a Gordon and Mary Betty Moore Foundation grant joint with CMU, and then we have various government proposals outstanding. And so the staffing at this level is kind of various domains, which is part of the strategy. So we have people from biosciences that are interested in computing, people from astrophysics that are interested in computing. I'm a computer science PhD that's interested in science, and we have some other staff. We have a connection there in health sciences as well. Okay. So that's kind of the bric-a-brac. What do we do? So, although I said I wouldn't necessarily motivate the science story, I do want to kind of give my version of it briefly, which is that traditionally in science, what you would do is couple your data acquisition activities to your science, right? You would generate hypothesis and then design an experiment to go collect data in order to answer that question. And so increasingly what you see is that those two activities are decoupled, right? You can acquire data en masse, independent of any particular hypothesis, put all that data into some form of a database, and then do your science by writing queries against that database. And so I try to annoy scientists and sometimes be provocative by saying, all of science is reducing to a database problem, right? If you can ask your questions effectively against a database, then you can do science. And so we see this happening in astronomy and medicine and biology, and we've seen fantastic talks here describing these details. And I like to use examples from oceanography because I think they're a little bit less commonly seen. So some of the sources of data in oceanography, there's just ocean circulation simulations that generate sort of 15 gigabytes per simulated day, and you might want to do multi-decade climate studies with various parameterizations, so you end up generating quite a bit of data that needs to be analyzed. This is the Argo project, where they distributed these floats, these drogues, that drift with the currents, 3,000 of them around the country, and they telemeter their data back through the satellite, put all that in a database and study it. This device is really cool. This is an environmental sample processor from the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. This basically does wet lab chemistry in situ. So you drop one of these things out in the water flows in one side, and DNA sequences flow out the other. So this is sort of automating a lot of lab work. And then this last one is similar to the ESP. It's called the FlowCam, and so this is a digital camera that you also deposit out in situ. Water flows by, it takes pictures of the critters that go by, does some image analysis on them, tags them with some metadata, and sends back a stream of images. So in order to collect these types of images previously, you would spend $20,000 a day on ship time, go out and take a cup of water, bring it back to the lab, put it in the microscope, and snap a picture. And now you've got sort of a daily 24/7 stream of images coming back. This is a data problem that they're not microscope. I'm trying to think of what the noun form of microscopists are not used to having to deal with. Okay, and I want to point out that one way I sort of phrase this is that I think people in our field are kind of at war with these engineers who are accelerating data acquisition, right? And they're kind of winning, and they're kind of bragging about it. On the website for the FlowCam, they say, increase data collection exponentially with a FlowCam, as if that was the point, right? It was just to fill up your hard disk with images. The question is, what's on the other end helping you analyze those images? So I think maybe a charge to this community is, we need to say increase scientific knowledge exponentially with software X or something, and again, they're doing better than us at gathering it. Okay. So that's the generic story. Another aspect of this is it's not just about the big data. It's this big data problem is fractal, right? So at all scales, people can suffer big data problems. So these scientists were trained to sort of write everything down meticulously in a notebook, and then they started gathering too much, so they started to use spreadsheets. They started to get too many spreadsheets. They need to use databases. Databases become clusters, and then clusters move out to the cloud. And at each one of these steps, new technologies and new skills are required, and it's preventing them from doing their science. Okay, and so we need to think about solutions that are cross-scale, that can help them ease this transition at every step. And these are some of the examples. And we have sort of 100 petabytes at the other end with LSST, and then we have people that are sort of gathering up too many spreadsheets on their desktop at the other end. And the long tail is getting fatter. And I had a quote on here that I took off, but Alex Zalay likes to quote William Gibson, who says, the future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed. And I think that sort of applies to this as well. Okay. So I'm going to talk about this talk. That was a bit of an introduction, and I'm going to push through 3 quick case studies, and then I want to see if there's time. I'm going to talk about a direction of research that I'm interested in for the last year or so. Okay. So the first case study is the Armbrust lab, which independently is also funded by Moore. And this is an interesting case study because they're in a period of transition. They are not the naive lab that is only just now counting new data. They've been doing it for a while. They're getting good at it, but they still definitely have data problems. And there's a couple of sources of their data problems. One of them is flow cytometry work, which is not quite like the FlowCam. It actually bounces lasers off the cells, and you can identify what kind of cell it is rather than taking pictures of it. But another source of data is this thing up here in the upper left, which is a Applied Biosystems solid sequencer. And this thing could potentially generate up to like 200 terabytes a day at steady state. Oh, sorry, 200 gigabytes a day. That's actually a pretty big difference. 200 gigabytes a day at steady state. The limiting factor here is actually the cost of reagents, so they're not quite at that level, but they're still having to do quite a bit of work. And so what this lab does is marine microbiology, and they study genomics, transcriptomics, and metagenomics of these marine communities. So metagenomics is the idea that you're studying the genomic properties of a population rather than a specific species. So you take a cup of water from various conditions out in the ocean, pour it in the back of this machine, and get out the sequences of the entire population and do some analysis on that. And that's a harder problem because you don't have a genome to map it to. You have to kind of guess what's going on a little bit more in a de novo way, as they say. Okay. So I'm not going to go into specifics about what we've actually done for them, but I want to kind of give a description of how they've matured as a lab. So in these 2 axes here, the y-axis is each point is a tool, a software tool, and the y-axis is sort of how that tool scales, and that's divided into 2 regions, whether it works on sort of a single site, a single machine, or whether it's a cluster of machines. And then on the x-axis, it's sort of how specialized the tool is. And so on the right-hand side, we have general purpose tools, and on the left-hand side, we have specific tasks. And so in the past, what they would use is these bioinformatics tools that are designed for a very specialized purpose, but would run in memory on a single machine. And the only real general purpose tool they used was Excel. And then as they started getting data, more and more data, they started going in a couple of directions. One is they looked at more and more generic tools, and so they would train their scientists to do a little bit of programming. They would do a little bit of SQL programming. They would use R for statistics. ANOJ is a web-based genome browser that's fairly generic. And they would also write their own software. They have a parallel program called pPlacer that takes sequences and positions them within a phylogenetic tree in parallel. And then WebBlast was a sort of web interface with a BLAST backend that they run locally in order to be more reliable and more efficient than NCBI's BLAST. The yellow dots are sort of other tools just for reference that we've looked at but haven't actually used. But I think where the eScience Institute is sort of helping out is up in this other quadrant where we have generic tools at a large parallel scale and how to sort of turn that quadrant into this quadrant, how to specialize them for these particular tasks. And the dotted line up there is to sort of represent the fact that we're not just interested in taking existing technology, but we also develop our own technology at times. Okay. So that's sort of generally what we're doing with the Armbrust lab, and I can talk to you later about what specifically we're doing. But I want to kind of jump onto another group, which is the Astrophysics group, who do simulations from the Big Bang forward. And so they run these massive scale gravity simulations, in-body simulations, that take months to run and 7.5 million QPU hours, and they save state for 500 time steps. And then the question is, how do you sort of do your science on this? How do you query this scale of data? And we did some initial work in order to see how this worked on kind of a smaller subset, just to see how the technologies might scale. And so the kind of questions we want to ask are things like this. This is the simplest kind of question we might be able to ask about this thing. You know, select a particular attribute from this. Find all the particles that are above a certain temperature. Okay. And this is reasonably realistic. We have astronomers working with this who tell us, yes, this is a reasonable thing that we might want to ask. And we've encoded it here in SQL, but you don't have to, of course. Okay, so what we did was compare a relational data. So this first test is going to seem a little silly in a couple of ways. So we did a relational database Z, it was SQL Server. We used Hadoop. How many people are familiar with Hadoop? Okay, so I kind of assumed I didn't need to run through the MapReduce thing, because I think we've heard it a lot here, so I'm not going to do that. It sounds like most of the room knows it. So we used Hadoop, and we used IDL. IDL is the existing version of the program written by astronomers that runs serially in memory. And so what you see here, this is only on a single node. This is not parallel. So that's what when I say it's sort of silly, why would you use Hadoop on a single node? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is to do a sort of baseline test, but the other is that it is still parallel. It is still running multi-threaded, so it's taking advantage of all 8 cores. And so what you see here is the database and Hadoop both are able to take advantage of all 8 cores and kind of outperform the IDL one before we've even done any sort of real scalability. And so that's kind of an interesting result, is that this hand-coded program that the astronomers built, we sort of beat it before we even really tried to do anything too fancy. And these data sets are very small, by the way. So this is very, very small, and these are kind of at the gigabyte scale. They're not too huge yet. Okay. Oh, and notice that this is a log scale on the y-axis as well. So these are pretty big differences when you see this. Okay. So when you do start doing multiple nodes, we don't use the IDL one anymore because it's not a parallel program. We just compare Hadoop with SQL Server. And SQL Server is not really a true parallel database for reasons I won't have time to get into, but it is able to do distributed query. And you see the sort of scalability curves you would expect. And at this small scale, only 1 to 8 nodes, SQL Server is sort of outperforming at each step, which is nice. Now, the question is, what happens when you go to 64 and 100? That's still open, and that's some of the work that we have planned that we've been talking to CMU about at this meeting. Okay. Picture's not so simple. One of the reasons why this was so nice is because the SQL Server was able to take advantage of an index on temperature. So that's why it's a lot better. If you don't have that opportunity, you get some sort of funny results. This is a very strange curve here for SQL Server, where it sort of got worse at 2 nodes, and then got better, and then got worse again. But it was highly repeatable. We were able to sort of get the same pattern every time. So it shows you that there's some complexity in what the database is doing in its parallelism. So it kind of depends on the query a little bit. Meanwhile, Hadoop has the same scalability curve you would expect. I didn't show you query 2, but it's basically very similar, except without the index. A slightly more complex query, you might want to do this. If you don't speak SQL, this is basically saying, find me all the particles at one time step that disappeared in some other time step that do not appear somewhere else. And so there's a nice little construct in SQL that you can use to express this called an outer join. In other languages, you can sort of make it work. Similar kind of plot, the database sort of wins because it's a nice natural feature. The only thing that changed here was Hadoop was sort of worse because it took a lot more instances of MapReduce jobs in order to express this outer join thing, but sort of a similar story.
I missed why you compare Hadoop and database query.
Because, so why in which direction? Why because it's obvious that the database would do better, or why because it's obvious that Hadoop would be?
No.
Well, because they both express the same query, I guess. They're both tools that can
Okay.
yeah. Sorry, yeah. So I'm showing you SQL. There's an encoding of this SQL query in Hadoop as well that I didn't show you. Sorry. So it's yeah. It's basically 2 different ways to implement the same task. Pig, which is sometimes a source of slowness. In these cases, we could sort of show that it was not really doing anything completely stupid. Like, pig wasn't really causing a big problem. Okay. And again, single node for Hadoop, so that's, of course, there's an overhead to scaling up. It's not designed to run a single node. It's designed to sort of do many nodes. Similar kind of case, you can imagine that this is still at 2,000 seconds, so this is pretty slow. So you can imagine that when we went out to 64 nodes or something like that, you would expect the Hadoop to sort of start to do better than the relational database. We didn't quite have a big enough cluster to really try those kind of numbers. Here's the pig script for the query 4. The point here is just to kind of compare, ease of, with respect to this cross-scale notion, you need to think about things like ease of use. And so if something is 400 lines long versus something that's 4 lines long, it matters. In this case, I think pig is sort of comparable to the SQL statement. I don't think there's any way to say necessarily this is definitely worse. It's more complicated to my eyes, but that's because I sort of come from the database background. So how many people think this is too complicated to write themselves or something? Is this bad or good or? Nobody cares. Okay. All right. So a different task from the same group, from the astrophysics group. This is taking the same data sets, these astrophysical simulations, and trying to find clusters of particles that share some property. In this case, the property is sort of, you can connect them by a radius jump, and sort of the friends of friends algorithm, as they say. So everything within a certain radius grouped together, and then recursively continue to group them that way. That may not have been clear, but the idea is pretty simple, so it may be fairly intuitive what we're trying to do. This is a common task in these astrophysics simulations to analyze them. So we implemented this in Dryad, and we ran some tests, independent of the relational test we were doing earlier. This is a more complicated algorithm, and we sort of compared two different ways of, the lines on this top one didn't show up, but basically it's whether you sort of do it like a quad tree, you divide it up into evenly spaced areas, or you do some kind of custom thing. That was one optimization we were experimenting with, as well as several others. This is mainly work by a student, Yangchul Kwan, with a few other people, and I sort of tagged along. And so Dryad works pretty well. This is comparing, the main thing you want to look at is this red circle, which shows that Dryad is competitive at a certain amount of parallelism with the hand-coded tools. In some cases, the hand-coded tools do better. In some cases, they do worse. But ultimately, Dryad's doing fine, and we didn't have to do anything sort of special. This is sort of unoptimized. Okay, so it's competitive. But what I think is more interesting is how much work it takes, even when you use something like Hadoop or Dryad, how much algorithmic work you have to do. And so what this is comparing is two different data sets, a skewed data set and a non-skewed data set. And by skew, I mean how much data tends to appear in one box or not, which really screws up parallel query processing quite a bit. And so the non-skewed, everything does well and is sort of trivial. With the skewed version, we have not really a clear story. We have the normal version takes a sort of unacceptably long time, but the optimized version fails completely because it ran out of memory. And so you've got to be, you've got to be very careful here. And then, but of course, it's not that it's just poorly written or anything, because in the for a different kind of optimization, it does really, really well, and it blows the other one out of the water. And so I'm just trying to highlight that these challenges of sort of take technology X and apply them to problem Y are not trivial. You have to sort of do some new science to sort of figure them out. Okay. All right. So a final case study here. This is a diagram of a biochemical pathway from postdoc Betsy Skovrin in Mary Lidstrom's lab. And so she does wet lab experiments and measures gene expression data and then draws these visualizations. And these visualizations individually are very valuable in her community. Like, they're sort of publishable on their own if you can draw a convincing visualization. So what tool do you think she used to create this? That's exactly right. Okay, so if something changes in the data or she makes a mistake, what do you have to do? You redraw the thing. That's exactly right. If you want to change the color scheme, what do? You have to redraw the thing. If you want to change what the number of heads of the arrow, everything means something here, right? She wasn't just being sort of artistic. All these number of arrowheads and so forth all mean something very specific. But if you want to change how that visualization is done, you have to redraw the thing. Okay, so when we saw this thing, we just sat down for a very casual meeting, not even talking about working with them. But when I saw this, I was like, okay, we've got to automate this for you, because this is this is taking you months. And she admitted that she was taking her weeks to maintain these things. So I didn't actually do the work. I connected them with some collaborators we have at the University of Utah, Laura Lind and Claudia Silva, who are working on a tool where you can sort of draw with data. And I won't sell his work too much more, but suffice it to say that after a couple of weeks of work, he's able to kind of derive these things with a lot of extensions. For example, you can plot them and sort of maintain the connections and work with all this stuff just with a little bit of work. And Betsy's girlfriend is ecstatic. And the reason I bring this up, considering it's not my work, is just to say that at the eScience Institute, part of the thing we want to do is to not be susceptible to kind of a not invented here syndrome, right? We want to be able to look outside, take tools in, bring them in, and hand them off to people and say, great. And this presumably will generate some papers between the collaboration that we might participate in. But so far, most of the code was written by Laurel. Okay. So how much time do I have? 10 more minutes? Okay. So that's 3 areas of work that we are doing. And now I want to maybe turn to sort of something I'm interested in that has to do with this notion of cross-scale. And that is visualizations and mashups. Okay. So rolling back to this big data question, you can ask the question, why is there big data? And we said, well, one reason is because technology is improving and these engineers are getting really, really good at acquiring data. And so it's lowering the cost of data acquisition, so why not have it? But another reason that Jim Gray pointed out frequently was that every time you get a new data set, you need to compare it with every other data set that came before it, right? And so that generates kind of a quadratic growth in the number of derived data sets you're going to have. Does that make sense? Do people buy that? Sort of, maybe? Well, okay. So in science, when you compare two data sets, the comparison itself generates a new data set. And so you get this kind of explosion of growth. And take it on faith, I guess. So a corollary, though, I think, to this is that it's not just the number of data sets that scales quadratically because of this reason. It's also the number of applications you need. So every time you compare two data sets, you need sort of a little visualization application of some kind to explore the relationship between them. Okay. And so in order to keep up with this quadratic growth of new applications needed, we need to either entrain new people to do programming that previously didn't, or we need to make existing programmers more productive, or both. Okay. So some examples so in case you don't buy the two data sets compared in your applications, here's two data sets, right? Satellite images and crime incidence reports put together. That's a web application that gets a lot of traffic. It's quite nice. People use it. Crimemapping.com. You can go there. Another probably less useful one is your Twitter feed and your Flickr stream can be sort of mashed up to sort of create an application. That's an application. So basically, any two streams of data, or any two data sets you find, you'll find it makes some sense to think about a new application to compare them. So getting back to science, though, off of the web, while this maybe arguably isn't an application, it's rather sort of a video that I created, or I created. Actually, I didn't create it. We created it. This is the kind of thing I want to be able to make interactive, right? So what this shows is, there's a few different color scales here. The purple and pink is temperature, and the zooplankton concentration is this kind of red and brown, and then there's also phytoplankton that doesn't quite make as much of an appearance here. But what you can kind of immediately pick out from this 3D visual, and the arrows are pointing in the direction of velocity, and they're colored by magnitude of velocity. But what you can sort of immediately pick out is that the structure that's flowing through the temperature and coming out is that zooplankton and temperature are correlated, right? And so this is a visualization that highlights that relationship. They sort of knew this intuitively, or they had some evidence that this is true, but they had never seen it before we built this 3D visualization for them. How they queried this previously was to take slices, like guess and check, right? They would just take a slice through the 3D data set and look at it and compare right there. So to have the whole thing in one picture was sort of an aha moment for them. Okay. But these things take a really long time to run. This is scaled down to a particular spatial area. It's a very short time period. It was rendered offline to make a video. This kind of thing needs to be interactive and exploratory if we're going to take advantage of it. Okay. Why visualization at all? I sort of just motivated in that they had some aha moments, but in general, it makes some sense, right? I mean, the bandwidth of the human visual system is very high, right? So looking at lists of numbers is not very efficient, while capturing it all in a set of pixels or a moving set of pixels, you can sort of apprehend a lot more features at once. But some other reasons are, if you want to kind of write a question or write a program about the data to get the answer you want, it kind of presumes you know exactly what you're looking for. But the first thing people do a lot of times is just say, what does this phenomenon look like? What does this feature look like? And you can't really express that in something like SQL is the joke I'm making there. And so what this thing is this particular phenomenon is the salt wedge. This is the Columbia River estuary in the northwest U.S., and this is the Pacific Ocean here, and this is Oregon, and this is Washington. And this is the tides pushing in and out salty water. And so it turns out that the mixture of salt and fresh water is what drives the whole ecosystem and is affected by anthropogenics. And it's sort of a big deal for policy and for science and for just basic understanding of the physics of the estuary. And so understanding how far upstream this salt wedge can go in a particular year is of high importance. And so you can make an animation like this, and you can just sort of see the structure of it. And people that write the simulation code that generated this data get new intuition just from looking at the visualization of it. Okay. So one more example of this type of thing, more of a sort of a static plot, but it's still the kind of thing that I want to bless with interactivity. This is again the Columbia River estuary, the bottom salinity. Okay. This is again the salinity at the bottom of the river. This is an average over 10 years. This is an average over 1 year, and this is the difference between the average over that 1 year and the average overall. So it's showing that 1999 was a bit of an anomaly. It was especially salty. Similarly, 2001 was especially fresh, and 2006 was very typical. So this is all yellow, so it didn't change that much. Okay, so the amount of data that had to be touched to generate this visualization is extremely high, right? It had to run over 10 years worth of simulation data. And now, as soon as you make this thing, you think, well, now show me temperature. Well, that's a whole other program that has to be written and a whole other job to do. So being able to have an interactive exploration of this type of thing is of high importance. Okay. So we have some work already in this space, and I don't really have time to talk about it, but I just want to sort of motivate a direction that I'm sort of headed, which is kind of a VisDB. So sort of a marriage of databases and visualization. Not sort of databases where they pipe the results out to a visualization system, but rather get the visualization algorithms and primitives into the database as part of the query processing engine, and that's something I'm sort of interested in. So it might require a new data model for this notion of structured and unstructured grids. It's not tabular. A new query language, because you need to have these visualization primitives in there, and you need to have the operators be sort of grid aware. There's new indexing optimization techniques that we can take from the visualization community who have already done a lot of the groundwork. And then maybe the fuzzier direction here is the sort of smart query results. And the idea is that the result of a query should be an application or should be a mashup or should be something interactive rather than just a dumb list of tuples. And so making the database smart about that lends some benefits. And I'll give you one example. You know, if the first thing you're going to do with a million tuple result is draw a 100 by 200 pixel image, you know, something's wrong, right? If you could express that to the database and say, all I'm going to do is compress the hell out of this thing, the database might be smarter about how it goes about evaluating the query. And right now, we can't really do that very well. Okay, so that's it. We have a ton of projects. We have more projects than we have sort of people to work on them. And because we have so many projects, I think we're a little more immune to the sort of not invented here syndrome. We don't feel like we have to sort of do everything because there's always more coming down the pipe. I recommend against kind of a one-size-fits-all solution. You know, you can cherry-pick techniques from various communities and try to design something new. This notion of cross-scale, I think, is very important. It's not just the big guys. It's not just the small guys. It's sort of helping. No one group has requirements from only one of those communities. And then I mentioned this number of applications scale linearly with number of bytes. So we need to get really fast about developing visual, compelling, interesting applications. And then I think the VisDB for science is a good research problem to work on. So that's it.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think what you find is, there's a bit of a direction of research in the visualization community that's called query-driven visualization. And so what this does is select out subsets of the data to look at and visualize those. To my eyes and to database people's eyes, this is a very, very, very primitive query language. And so what I'd like to do is have more data analytics that you can do in a database, but simply can't do all the kinds of visualization primitives with the visualizations that know how to do the primitives but aren't very smart with how to do the back end. Right, and so I think that there's probably a space there. Again, we haven't built such a system yet, but I posit that there's I have people in the visualization community that agree that maybe there's such a system can be built. So.
organizations nowadays. I suppose they all share the same kind of vision. Looking at what you have been doing, I mean, it's very broad. You work with all kinds of projects at different scales. In one sentence, what do you think is the mission that you have?
Keep University of Washington competitive in this changing space. Literally, that's our initial, where it was formed for. Now we broadened out because of this new collaboration, but originally the place was formed to focus on UW problems. And so that's, because you're right, you can't solve everybody's problem. So that's actually how we limit it, is by looking at locally first.